The first thing you notice isn't panic. It's not fear in the way movies show it. There's no racing heartbeat, no dramatic collapse, no warning siren inside your head. What you feel instead is something quieter, heavier, almost polite. A subtle tightening behind the eyes. A pressure that doesn't announce itself, but slowly rearranges the way you think. You're still functioning, still speaking, still making decisions. But something is off, and you can't quite name it. This is how the mind begins to collapse under invisible pressure. Not with chaos, but with silence. You've probably experienced this without realizing it. A moment where the stakes were high, but everything looked calm on the surface. A meeting where all eyes were on you, yet no one said anything threatening. A decision that mattered deeply but arrived wrapped in normalcy. You told yourself you were fine. You believed you were thinking clearly. But later, sometimes much later, you looked back and wondered how you missed what now seems obvious. How you said the wrong thing, chose the wrong path, trusted the wrong instinct. It feels mysterious in hindsight, like your intelligence abandoned you at the worst possible time. But it didn't. It was overwhelmed, quietly. The human mind was never designed for constant, low-grade pressure. It evolved for moments of clear danger and clear safety, not for the modern condition of being perpetually evaluated, compared, measured, and watched. Our ancestors faced threats that were loud and immediate. A predator, a rival, a storm. The response was simple: act or freeze. Today, the threats are abstract. They have no teeth, no claws, no clear beginning or end. Expectations, social judgment, consequences that exist only in the future. These pressures don't trigger panic. They trigger distortion. Under invisible pressure, the mind doesn't shatter. It bends. It narrows. It begins to conserve energy in ways that feel logical, but aren't. Your attention tightens like a lens zooming in too far, cutting off the periphery. You stop seeing alternatives. You stop questioning assumptions. You don't become irrational. You become efficient. And that efficiency is the trap. Because the brain, when stressed but not alarmed, prioritizes speed over depth, familiarity over accuracy, safety over truth. This is why intelligent people are often the most vulnerable. Intelligence relies on pattern recognition, on internal models built from past experience. Under pressure, the brain leans harder on those models. It stops updating them. It assumes the present moment is just a variation of something you've already survived. And so you respond automatically, confidently, incorrectly. The collapse doesn't feel like confusion. It feels like certainty. There is a particular kind of moment where this happens most often. It's the moment when everything seems normal, but something important is at stake. When no one is yelling, but everyone is watching. When failure wouldn't kill you, but it would change how you're seen. In these moments, the mind becomes deeply protective of the self-image. It starts filtering reality not for accuracy, but for emotional safety. You hear what you can handle. You ignore what threatens your sense of control. You don't lie to yourself deliberately. You simply stop noticing. Think about the last time you felt pressure without urgency. Not a crisis, but a weight. A deadline that kept moving closer. A relationship conversation you kept postponing. A choice you knew you had to make, but hoped would make itself. Notice how your thinking changed during that time. How certain ideas felt too heavy to touch. How you avoided specific questions without realizing you were avoiding them. That avoidance wasn't laziness. It was your mind trying to keep you functional by reducing cognitive strain. Unfortunately, what keeps you functional in the short term often sabotages you in the long term. Neuroscience has a quiet term for this: cognitive load. But that phrase doesn't capture the lived experience. Cognitive load feels like mental crowding. Too many tabs open, too many background processes running at once. When the load becomes too high, the brain doesn't shut down. It simplifies. It starts using shortcuts that feel reasonable, even wise. It trusts first impressions more. It defers to authority more readily. It favors familiar narratives over uncomfortable facts. And all of this happens beneath conscious awareness. This is why pressure doesn't always make you anxious. Sometimes it makes you calm in a way that's almost eerie. You stop feeling conflicted. You stop weighing options. You tell yourself the decision is obvious. That calmness can feel like clarity, but it isn't. It's compression. Your mental world has shrunk to something manageable. And in that smaller world, the wrong choice can feel like the only choice. There's a cruel irony here. The moments when we most need reflection are the moments when the mind is least capable of it. Under invisible pressure, the brain reallocates resources away from introspection and toward performance. It's trying to keep you moving, keep you socially acceptable, keep you from standing out in a way that might cost you. Evolutionarily, this made sense. Standing out used to be dangerous. Today, it's often necessary. The collapse becomes visible only in hindsight. When the pressure lifts, when the meeting ends, the decision is made, the moment passes, your thinking slowly expands again. Possibilities return. Questions resurface. And with them comes regret, confusion, sometimes shame. You ask yourself how you didn't see it, why you didn't speak up, why you ignored that quiet signal in your body that something wasn't right. But the truth is uncomfortable. You didn't fail to think. You thought exactly as a pressured mind is designed to think. Invisible pressure doesn't announce itself because it doesn't feel like danger. It feels like responsibility, like expectation, like the need to hold it together. And that's why it's so effective. You don't resist it. You cooperate with it. You tell yourself this is just adulthood, just professionalism, just life. Meanwhile, your inner world is slowly being rearranged to prioritize survival over insight. What makes this even more dangerous is that modern culture rewards the outward signs of functioning under pressure. We admire composure. We praise decisiveness. We celebrate people who handle it without complaint. Rarely do we ask what it costs internally. Rarely do we question whether that decisiveness came from clarity or from collapse. A mind under pressure can look incredibly competent from the outside, even as it becomes increasingly rigid on the inside. There's a moment, often subtle, where the collapse deepens. It's when pressure becomes identity, when you stop saying, "This situation is stressful," and start saying, "This is just how I am." Tense, driven, always on. At that point, the mind no longer registers pressure as something external. It becomes the baseline. And when pressure is the baseline, distortion feels normal. You don't notice how narrow your thinking has become because you can't remember what openness felt like. This is why chronic pressure is so corrosive. Not because it overwhelms you all at once, but because it slowly trains your brain to operate in survival mode, even when survival isn't required. You become less curious, less flexible, less willing to sit with uncertainty. And those losses don't announce themselves. They masquerade as maturity, realism, toughness. Yet beneath all of this, the mind is still trying to protect you. Even in its collapse, there is a kind of intelligence at work. The brain is doing what it has always done when resources are strained. It reduces complexity. The tragedy is not that this happens, but that we mistake it for truth. We assume the narrowed view is the accurate one. We trust the compressed version of reality because it feels stable. The way out is not to eliminate pressure, that's impossible, but to learn how to recognize its invisible forms. To notice when calmness is actually constriction, when certainty is actually avoidance, when efficiency is quietly replacing understanding. This awareness doesn't come naturally, because awareness itself requires cognitive space. It requires slowing down in moments that demand speed and questioning yourself in moments that reward confidence. There is a different kind of strength available here, one that looks weaker from the outside. It's the strength of pausing when everyone expects motion, of admitting uncertainty when certainty would be applauded, of creating small pockets of reflection inside high-stakes moments. This doesn't make you immune to pressure, but it changes how pressure shapes you. It gives your mind room to breathe before it bends too far. The most important realization is this: when your mind collapses under invisible pressure, it's not betraying you. It's responding to a world that constantly asks for more than it was designed to give. Understanding this doesn't excuse every mistake, but it replaces self-blame with insight. And insight, unlike pressure, expands the mind instead of shrinking it. Because the moment you can see the pressure, it stops being invisible. And the moment it stops being invisible, it starts to lose its power. When pressure becomes visible, something subtle but profound begins to shift. The weight doesn't disappear, but it changes texture. It stops pressing directly against your thoughts and instead becomes something you can observe, something with edges. And in that space, between the pressure and your awareness of it, the mind regains a fraction of its lost depth. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to matter. The problem is that most people only recognize invisible pressure after it has already shaped a decision, a relationship, or a sense of self. They notice it in retrospect, when the cost has already been paid. That delayed awareness can feel cruel, like waking up after a dream and realizing you agreed to something you never would have accepted while fully awake. But this delay isn't a personal failure. It's a feature of how pressure operates. It thrives in real time and reveals itself only when the moment has passed. In the moment, invisible pressure often disguises itself as urgency without panic. You're not afraid, you tell yourself. You're just being realistic. You're not avoiding a hard truth. You're simply prioritizing. These internal narratives are not lies. They're partial truths, chosen because they're easier to carry. The mind, under load, doesn't have the luxury of holding everything at once. So it chooses a story that allows you to keep moving. There's a particular sensation that accompanies this state, one that's easy to miss. It's a slight flattening of emotion. You don't feel overwhelmed, but you also don't feel deeply engaged. The world becomes functional. Conversations turn transactional. Decisions become mechanical. This emotional narrowing is not numbness. It's focus turned inward. The mind is conserving energy by reducing the richness of experience. And while that conservation can help you endure, it also distances you from signals that would otherwise guide you. Under invisible pressure, intuition doesn't vanish. It gets quieter. Its voice is drowned out by the steady hum of obligation and expectation. You still sense when something is off, but the signal arrives without urgency, without drama. It's easy to dismiss. You tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when things calm down. But later rarely comes on its own. Pressure has a way of reproducing itself, of creating the conditions for more pressure, until the narrow state becomes the norm. What makes this especially dangerous is how convincing it feels. A pressured mind often feels disciplined, focused, even virtuous. You're doing what needs to be done. You're not indulging in overthinking. You're being strong. And from the outside, this often looks like success. People praise your composure. They rely on you. They assume you're handling it. Each affirmation reinforces the pattern, teaching your mind that collapse is rewarded as competence. But there is a cost, and it accumulates quietly. Over time, decisions made under invisible pressure tend to cluster around the familiar and the safe. You take fewer risks, not because you've evaluated them and found them lacking, but because risk requires mental space. Creativity diminishes, not because you've lost it, but because creativity is inefficient. It asks you to wander, to tolerate uncertainty, to hold contradictory ideas. Under pressure, the mind closes those doors. Eventually, something cracks, not explosively, but softly. You might notice a growing sense of detachment, or a vague dissatisfaction that doesn't have a clear cause. You've done everything right, and yet something feels wrong. This is often when people start questioning their choices, their careers, their relationships, without being able to articulate what they're questioning. They assume the problem is external. They look for changes in circumstance, not realizing the real shift happened internally, long ago, under pressure they never named. There's a moment, if you're paying attention, when the mind offers a quiet warning. It's not a thought so much as a feeling, a sense of being slightly out of alignment with yourself. It might show up as irritability over small things, or as a reluctance to think about the future. These are not signs of weakness. They're signs that your inner world has been compressed for too long, that parts of you have been set aside to keep functioning. The path back is not dramatic. There's no sudden release, no single insight that restores everything. It begins with permission. Permission to slow down internally, even when the external pace remains fast. Permission to question your own certainty. Permission to feel conflicted without immediately resolving the conflict. These small acts create micro-expansions in the mind, moments where complexity is allowed back in. One of the most counterintuitive steps is learning to distrust the feeling of obviousness. When a decision feels too clear, too clean, it's often a sign that alternatives have been prematurely discarded. This doesn't mean the decision is wrong, but it does mean it deserves a second look. Not a spiral of doubt, but a gentle widening of the frame. What am I not seeing? What would this look like if I weren't under pressure? Another step is reconnecting with the body. Invisible pressure lives in the mind, but it announces itself physically long before it becomes conscious. A tight jaw, shallow breathing, a constant readiness to respond. These sensations are not background noise. They're information. When you learn to notice them without immediately trying to fix them, they become anchors, pulling you back into the present moment where more options exist. There's a quiet courage in this kind of awareness. It doesn't look impressive. It doesn't make for dramatic stories, but it changes the trajectory of a life in subtle ways. Decisions become slightly more aligned. Conversations become slightly more honest. The inner world regains some of its lost dimensionality. And over time, these small shifts compound. The ultimate realization is that invisible pressure is not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be understood. It arises from caring, from responsibility, from the desire to belong and to do well. These are not flaws. The danger comes from never questioning how much they are shaping you, from mistaking endurance for health and collapse for strength. When you learn to see invisible pressure for what it is, you stop identifying with the narrowed version of yourself it produces. You recognize that the calm, certain, efficient mind is not your whole mind. It's a state, not an identity, and states can change. There will always be moments when your thinking narrows, when pressure bends you toward simplicity. That's part of being human, but those moments no longer define you. They become signals rather than destinations, reminders to pause, to breathe, to let the mind expand again before it locks into a shape that doesn't quite fit. And in that expansion, even if it's brief, you rediscover something essential, the quiet, resilient depth of a mind that doesn't just survive pressure, but learns from it.